Hello, I'm Rabia Chaudhry. I invite you to join me every Tuesday for new episodes of Nighty Night Bedtime Stories to Keep You Awake, now on Podcast One. This new incarnation of Nighty Night is an anthology of stories that bring to life classic horror stories, some you're definitely familiar with, and others you'll be hearing for the first time. Join me as I tuck you into bed with stories that will leave you sleepless all night long. Get new episodes of Nighty Night every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode of The Prosecutors is brought to you by Huggies Little Movers. Get your baby's butt into Huggies Little Movers. We got you, baby. I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are The Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, opening statements and testimony begins in the Karen Read trial. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my adorable co-host, Alice.
You're just trying to make up for homely. You're going to have to,
You're never going to let that go, are you?
Never going to let that go, nor will our loyal listeners. But
I was really talking about your kids. So.
I know. I was going to say, it's not me that's adorable. My kids are adorable. They're okay.
The kids are adorable.
They're okay.
They're great.
They're all right.
They're great.
No, I like them, and I like you, Brett. And you know why? Because we are gluttons for punishment. We spend all day in trial in court, and then what do we do when we go home? We listen to other people's trials, in this case, the Karen Read trial. But we do that for you guys because even though this is televised, there's a lot going on. And there are a lot of sidebars. And there are a lot of arguments and testimonies that people have questions about. So we are here to try and explain what's going on because you guys have asked us to do so. So you ask, we'll do it.
Before we even get started, two things that people have noticed. Some of y'all watch a lot of trials. Some of you don't watch very many. This trial was more interesting than most, but two things they do. They do a lot of sidebars, as Alice said. The reason for that's pretty simple. My wife and I were talking about this last night. I really like the judge in this case, by the way. She's great. Not criticizing her. But the Murdaugh case, one thing that was great about Murdaugh is in the morning of trial, before the jury showed up, they would kind of hash out everything that was going to happen that day. They'd go ahead and talk about exhibits, what exhibits were going to be admitted. They talked about the legal issues that were going to come up, and the judge made rulings. And I feel like it set the day up so much better because then once the actual testimony started, you kind of knew where you were. And maybe Poot would make an objection, but he would say, just, I've made this objection, but it's for the record. And then you could just move forward. In this case, they don't do that. They just show up and they start talking, and issues arise that they don't want to talk about in front of the jury all the time. And so they're going to sidebar to talk about that. And that's why that is happening.
Yeah, everything you said is right. And here's the thing. We've said this a lot, but especially with district court judges, they are given incredible amounts of discretion to run their courtroom as they see fit. So it really is about how they want to run it. So some like to deal with things ahead of time, not ahead of time. I will say I prefer dealing with these things ahead of time because the jurors, remember, they're always going to blame the lawyers if they have to sit around or the trial is dragged out longer. Ultimately, even if you're the defense, they're going to start blaming irrationally the defendant, the government, whatnot, because they're having to sit there day after day after day. So what we often face in our trials at the end of trial, once like the gavel bangs and the jury is excused, oftentimes the judge will turn to the parties and say, counsel, who do you intend to call tomorrow? You do not do this on the fly. Of course, you can make adjustments as you go, but you typically know who you're going to call. And, we'll kind of say, oh, these 5 witnesses, Your Honor, and we'll have these 3 on deck in case we make it to them. We doubt it because we think these 5 will take all day. The other side will say, well, Your Honor, remember that witness? We had that motion in limine about them, and then you'll kind of hash it out there. That's how you deal with issues ahead of time, because there are not, as we've said before as well, not usually Perry Mason moments in court. Even if you're responding, you're cross-examining a witness, when you know a particular witness is going to take the stand, you know what their testimony generally is going to be, and you also know the issues that will surround it. So that's why it's not surprising to have sidebars. It's just when you have them. In this particular case, they're coming as they arise. And guess what? That does happen. It's just they're not being dealt with ahead of time. So you're having, as the public watching, as the jury, you're having to be interrupted a lot because that's the flow of this particular trial.
And the way this judge does things, she's very protective of the jury and really doesn't want them hearing anything extraneous. Alice and I tried a month-long case once where we actually had trial every day, and it lasted all day. And we had maybe 2 sidebars, but but this one, they have sidebars all the time, and it's a little annoying. But going to this protecting the jury, the other thing they're doing is the way they object is incredibly limited. They just say objection, which I prefer because a lot of times you'll know that's objectionable, but you're not even really sure exactly why. Well, in this case, you can just stand up and say objection, and then the judge, who probably knows the rules better than you, can be like, oh yeah, that is hearsay, or oh yeah, that was leading. Or, oh, no foundation there. Or that's argumentative, right? So in this case, all they have to do is say objection, and then the judge is going to rule on it. Interestingly, for appeals, I guess all your potential issues are preserved because you could always say, when I objected, I meant this. And the judge obviously got it wrong. That's not typical, but it's not so far out of the norm. It's unusual. Like I said, this judge just really doesn't want these lawyers making sort of speaking objections where they're kind of making an argument to the jury through their objection. She's really avoiding that, which is why there's so many sidebars, and it's why the objections are done the way they are.
Took the words out of my mouth. That's exactly what I was going to say, is that it's partly her protection of the jury, because attorneys, you fight about this all the time in depositions, in trial, where one side will start getting annoyed that the other side keeps objecting. I'm like, Your Honor, now it's just argument by attorney, and then it turns into a bickering fight. So part of this is to cut down on that argument. But enough about how trials are run. What happened in this trial, Brett?
So we're back today with the Karen Read trial. Just to recap for those of you who may have forgotten, who paid no attention to this because you blissfully are unaware of this case. So John O'Keefe was found dead in the snow during a blizzard outside the home of some friends, depends on who you ask, who were also police officers. He was a police officer. A lot of police officers were over at this house after going out to a bar with him and his girlfriend, Karen Read. The prosecution says that when Karen Read dropped him off at the house that night, he never made it inside because she actually hit him with her car and left him in the snow to die. The prosecution also says that when this happened, she was very intoxicated. According to the defense, what actually happened was that John O'Keefe did make it into that house, and there, either because of some prior bad blood between this family, there was sort of an orchestrated fight, essentially. Like they got him there to maybe not kill him, but to attack him, and during the attack he was killed, or there was some sort of confrontation that began in that home that led to John O'Keefe's death, and the people in that home decided to put him in the snow and leave him there, and then frame Karen Read for his murder. What's interesting about this case is for that to happen, and I think the defense readily agrees with this, there has to be a pretty large conspiracy between members of the Canton Police Department, and Canton is where this happened, members of the state police department, the Boston Police Department, an ATF agent, some firefighters,
first responders,
the chief of police, various people, a lot of people who all know each other because they all grew up together, have conspired to protect this family, the Albert family, and to frame Karen Read. And those are the two narratives we have. And it's a fascinating case because the defense isn't really arguing this is an accident. And they aren't really even arguing just, there's some reasonable doubt about exactly how this happened and everything else. I mean, they'll make those arguments, but really the thrust of their argument, and you're going to see that as we get into opening statements, is this is a conspiracy, and it's one that really has captivated a lot of people, and a lot of people find some credibility with. So with that, let's start off with the prosecution opening. The prosecutor, Mr. I would say Lally, but it's often Lally, Mr. Lally. I love these Boston. I mean, I love Boston.
They're great names.
I love Boston. They're great names, they're great accents. Everything's great about them. I love them. So he starts off the way you often have prosecutors start off in a murder case, talking about John O'Keefe. He's trying to humanize him. He wants the jury to care about him. He wants the jury to want justice for him. He wants to make this case about him, not about anybody else, not even really about the defendant, but about him. Talks about how he raised his sister's kids after she died, how he stepped up, and how he was beloved in the community, a guy that everybody thought was just a great guy who died tragically at the defendant's hands. He then begins to do what you often do in an opening statement. He lays out the evidence and what the jury will hear, including from people like first responders, firefighters, police officers. He'll say to the jury that the defendant, Karen Read, repeatedly said that she hit John. He'll note a few things that they're going to show. For instance, that John was lying on top of grass rather than snow. This was significant because it indicated that his body ended up where it did before the snow started falling, at least in mass, and before John was dead, as the heat of his body would melt any snow that was beneath him. The prosecution also notes that the tail light on Karen Read's car was shattered, and witnesses will testify that Karen had parked right in front of where John's body would be found the night before when the both of them came to the home. Then he sort of backs up a little bit. So he talks about the night. Then he talks about a New Year's trip to Aruba. John, Karen, the kids, and apparently like 70 people. It was a big old trip. Are invited by Laura and Marietta Sullivan. By day 2, according to the prosecution, Karen and the Sullivans are fighting. John is the godfather to Marietta's kids. John and Karen were heard screaming at each other. Karen had been texting with a man named Brian Higgins in an amorous nature. Brian Higgins will turn out to be an ATF agent who was at the home the night that John died. Karen will claim that John was cheating on her with Marietta and had done so in Aruba. So this is laying the foundation for cracks in this relationship, tensions that could be building to an explosion that results in John's death. The prosecution also mentions that info from the car will show that it moved backwards at over 20 miles an hour at around the time John would have been hit and around the time when witnesses are going to say they saw Karen and John arrive at this home. Now, in many ways, this is a great opening because it's kind of overwhelming. It really lays out a lot of evidence. And if he can back up the opening with the evidence, you left it kind of feeling like this case is going to be straightforward. But it wasn't all good. He mentioned a ton of names, which is not helpful, and it's not necessary. And it's definitely confusing, and it's boring. And if there's anything about his opening that sort of telegraphed the future of his presentation, he is not an engaging speaker. He is not someone that makes you sit up and listen. Contrasted to the defense attorneys are very lively, whether you like them or not. They're very lively. They're top of their game. I think one of them practices in California. He's represented Harvey Weinstein, a few other famous people. These guys are some of the best. He's kind of just a typical prosecutor from a mid-sized town. He's here. He's doing his job. He's going to lay out the evidence. So he's not going to exactly fire you up. And there are things about his opening, like insisting on naming every single person they're going to call. When you're the jury, you're just like, I have no idea who these people are. It's kind of like when you walk into an interview and there's like 10 people there to interview you and every one of them introduces themselves and you're like, I have no idea who any of you are. And I'm not going to remember any of these names. It's the same type of thing, but for the jury. So the prosecution opening, in some ways, it was almost too detailed rather than just sort of laying out the general theory and the evidence that will support it. And like I said, you're going to see that as we move forward in this case, kind of over and over again with this prosecution.
That's a great point, Brett, because I think the way you summed up the evidence, it's so powerful. And that was in maybe 5 sentences max. And I think a lot of that powerful evidence did get overwhelmingly piled on with the long list of witnesses and too much detail. Remember, this is the first almost the first time. Sometimes in voir dire, the jury will hear a little bit about the background of the case. They'll know that someone died and the person on trial is accused of being the cause of the death, that sort of thing. But there's a lot of information coming at someone, and your brain can only handle so much information at once. That's why we talk about that whole opening statements building a bookshelf. You don't want to fill in all the bookshelves all at once because people will not remember, but you want to give them kind of the structure in which to think of the case. So the best opening statements, in my opinion, give you some of the most damning evidence up front so that you leave that opening statement thinking, geez, why are we here? That seems pretty straightforward. If he's laying on grass and we know it was a nor'easter and it started, snowing after 12 o'clock in droves and, this was like piles of snow, then of course he had to have been dead before 12 o'clock. And who pulled out at 12 o'clock? Karen Read. That's what you want the jury thinking. And then you want that kind of shelf that you're building for all the evidence. You want it to be really broad strokes that they can remember easily, that they can recall right away, even days later, even weeks later. Because remember, they're filling that shelf weeks, months later, especially in this case, because the case is taking so long. So you want something catchy and something that sticks. Well, you know what the defense does? They do something like that. They do something very punchy, very easy to remember, that sticks. David Yannetti starts by saying, Karen Read was framed. That is honestly a really good theme. It's not hard to remember. I'm not saying it's a good tactic. I'm saying in terms of the jury's going to remember that. They absolutely know that every single shelf is going to go towards she was framed, right? And look, this is bold and risky. You are saying that whole long list that Lolly just laid out of witnesses you're going to hear from, they all had to be in part of a massive conspiracy to frame Karen Read. Like, Karen Read is not the most hated woman in this town, so why her, right? But here's the other thing. This is all the defense really has. And the defense attorney goes on to say, the Alberts are well connected in law enforcement, and they were able to orchestrate a frame job. So the investigation was shoddy, it was biased, and it was faulty. That's why it was all on purpose to frame her. But that's really strange because on one hand, the defense is arguing how bad the police are. They can't even investigate correctly. They don't know what they're doing. They're biased. Yet they're able to pull off this incredibly sophisticated frame job. And whatever, we'll put that aside, right? This is the defense's opening argument. No one's objecting. You're not really going back and forth and arguing at this point.
And this is often a thing you hear. One thing I think it's important to remember, this is not necessarily a criticism that they're inconsistent. The defense doesn't have to necessarily be consistent. The prosecution has to pick a theory and prove it. The defense just has to make you doubt. So they got a pincer attack on you, right? They're saying on the one hand, there's just the sophisticated conspiracy, and that might draw you in. You may buy that. But on the other hand, they're saying, look, the police didn't even know what they were doing. They made all these mistakes. And so if you're somebody who says, look, I don't really buy conspiracies, but I can buy that, you can sort of get behind it. So it's actually, it is inconsistent, but it's not necessarily a bad thing that they are inconsistent.
In some ways, it's kind of like you can have your cake and eat it too. Right? Like both, even though they're inconsistent, someone can buy it. So the defense goes on to say Brian Albert was a cop and a first responder. And he says that Albert did nothing to help John O'Keefe after he heard that John was found on the front yard. And he says that the Albert home was never searched, probably because Albert's brother was a Canton police officer. And so we do know that John O'Keefe was found on the Albert property, but the home was never searched as part of, I guess, the criminal scene. Yannetti goes on to draw a web of connections between various police officials and the Alberts. Kind of this like, look how interconnected everybody is. They're so interconnected, so there has to be some sort of conspiracy because someone is someone's, best friends, fathers, dog walkers, etc., right? Everyone is connected in some way. And they want you to think it's very suspicious that all these cops who live very close to each other, work together, know each other so well, and were even family, suggesting that this is actually part of the cover-up and conspiracy. We've talked about this last episode, which is that those of you who are teachers probably are friends with some other teachers because you see each other every single day. I mean, Brett and I have a podcast because we work together. You know, how weird is it that two prosecutors know each other? Well, you could probably say the same for any profession. The people that you work with, you probably work with them. You probably work with them, you probably drink with them, you probably hang out with them. But the defense here is trying to draw upon those close connections as something nefarious.
Guys, we're so excited to talk about one of our favorite sponsors, Babbel. A lot of you guys want to learn a language. I understand it's something that I'm interested in doing as well, but only 1 in 5 Americans have done it. Learning a new language is on everybody's bucket list. And if that's you, make 2024 the year you finally check it off the list with Babbel. You can be better and a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you to speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. And Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world.
Babbel has these convenient courses that really help you learn real-life conversation skills in a different language. I speak multiple languages, but honestly, I forget how to do simple things like ask for directions or order food if I don't use it every day. But you guys know I love to travel. Well, when I'm about to travel to another country, I pull up Babbel's convenient courses that help me remember how to order food. And not just that, to make sure I have the right pronunciation and accent for the region that I am going to with their interaction with speech recognition technology. That is such a cool tool. And you know what? It works. People actually understand me when I go on vacation. I really love how easy Babbel has made learning another language. Here's a special limited time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/prosecutors. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/prosecutors. Spelled BABBEL.com/prosecutors. Rules and restrictions may apply.
And it's one reason it's so important when you have a death of a cop to try and get people who don't really know that officer in as quickly as possible. I mean, the problem here is you've got sort of two problems. Number one, it's a cop died, but he also died on the lawn of another cop. So you've got sort of both problems. You know, he's a Boston police officer. Brian Albert's a Boston police officer. His brother's a Canton police officer. Canton initially is going to investigate this, but then they're going to recuse and they're going to turn over to the state. And you would think, oh, that's great. They're going to turn it over to the state, to this independent investigator named Michael Proctor. But unfortunately, you know, Massachusetts, much like the world, it's very small and everybody knows each other.
And so enters Michael Proctor in the defense's opening statement. We know him as the lead investigator, and he's described by Yannetti as close friends with the Alberts. So, well, gosh darn, Canton recuses themselves. They turn over to the state, but they turn over to a state investigator who is, you got it, close friends with the Alberts who are conspiring this whole frame job. They explain that Michael Proctor was in a wedding. They called him second family. And while Karen Reed is just this outsider, these friends who know each other so well, they're going to bond together and they're going to frame Karen, who they have no familial or friendly ties with. And Yannetti then notes that there was never a search warrant of the Alberts' home, but also, like, it's honestly thinking about it, not clear how you would get a search warrant for their home because there's no evidence that a crime occurred in the house, right? The taillights are outside. He's found outside and the cocktail glass is outside. It's not clear. I'm not even sure what the search warrant would say to get probable cause in order to be able to search the home. So that's something to think about whenever you hear someone raise those arguments is, remember, you still have to have probable cause, and it has to be probably something a little bit more than it's tangential to where the person is found. Now, if you can show that they were both inside, that there's evidence inside the home that could lead you to understand what happened outside the home, sure.
And look, I want you to remember this, because Alice has just brought up a really good point that's going to come up again and again about whether there was probable cause to search that home. A lot of people, they just act as if you could search the house because police have unlimited authority or something. I mean, some of the comments are almost frightening about, why didn't they just take everybody's phones and search everybody's phones and search everybody's house? And we're going to come back to that. But I want you to be thinking about this as we talk about the evidence, as you're hearing the witnesses in terms of probable cause, being weighing this for yourselves. Now, probable cause means there is a likelihood, not necessarily more likely than not, less than that, but close to 50. I mean, it's depending on which judge you ask, it's a little bit heavier, but that you're going to find evidence of a crime in the place that's going to be searched. The home is the most sacred place. It's the place that's hardest to get a search warrant for. Phones have gotten to be just about as bad because your entire life is there. If you're thinking about probable cause, think of it in two ways. Think back to the Delphi case. So the Delphi case, they had this search warrant. There's been like 15 Franks motions filed in that case. A Franks motion says the affidavit was insufficient for probable cause, either because it left things out or it put stuff in there that's not accurate. So this is what I want you to be thinking about. Think about, as you're hearing the evidence come in, what evidence would there be for searching that house, for writing an affidavit? How would you write the affidavit to show there was likely to be evidence of a crime inside the house? Number one, to do that. And number two, including exculpatory evidence, like stuff that is evidence against Karen Read, because you would have to include that if you want to go search this person's house who is unconnected to her. If there's evidence that she did it, that is exculpatory and has to be included in that probable cause affidavit. So be thinking about that just as we go through these witnesses and talk more about probable cause.
So the defense goes on in their opening statement to say that the problem was from the very beginning because the police didn't keep an open mind. They wanted to believe that Karen did it. One thing to note, back up real quick. Remember what we heard from the opening statement for the prosecution. What did police see within the first minute of John O'Keefe's body being found? Well, a woman who was in a relationship with him with a busted taillight, and he appeared to have traumatic injuries consistent with blunt force on the ground, dead. And that same woman wailing, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. Okay, so does that mean you don't keep an open mind? Also think of literally what the police saw within the first seconds of finding the victim's body. But Yannetti goes on and says that there are text messages which will show that Michael Proctor, that state investigator, called Karen Read, quote, names you'd reserve only for your worst enemies. There is evidence of this. This is not great that Proctor has sent these text messages, but he pulls out some of the worst things that he says and displays them in his opening statement. He says that Proctor sent text messages that he hoped Karen would kill herself, and that he searched Karen Read's phone for nude photos and was disappointed he hadn't found any yet. Obviously unconnected to the crime, trying to show how the lead investigator didn't really care about investigating the crime, just about some vendetta or some weird thing to do against Karen Read. Now, Proctor told a friend that the Alberts wouldn't catch a lot of heat because he was, quote, a Boston cop too.
So you can see this. I mean, look. Conspiracies are always hard to prove. Usually they don't have any basis. Here, Proctor has given the defense a gift, and it's a real gift, because it's a real basis to say that the investigation was biased and that there was an effort to protect the Alberts because they were police. And so you start off from a position that isn't purely speculative. Now, whether or not they'll be able to show any other evidence of that, we'll have to see. And eventually we're going to get to Proctor's testimony, and I don't know how we're going to keep our non-explicit rating when we get there, because it's bad.
Because
he's
explicit.
Very explicit.
Very explicit.
So that's going to be one.
I mean, it's
don't
terrible.
let your kids
terrible
listen to.
word choice. Like,
Oh, awful.
I'm sorry, not just terrible word choice. Terrible sentiments too. Sorry, not to belittle what he says. No, terrible word choice, but also terrible sentiments.
I mean, it's the kind of thing, people have asked, I hate to get on tangents, but that's what we do. People keep asking who brought this case, especially after Proctor's text messages come out. Of course you bring the case. What are you talking about? Like, I don't even know why people ask that. You got a cop who's dead, who obviously was killed by somebody. You got all this evidence that you think points to the defendant. You're going to bring the case. That doesn't mean you don't want to beat Proctor with a lead pipe. You do. And I'm telling you this, it also doesn't mean if this weren't a murder case. Like, if this were a DUI, they wouldn't have brought the case. If this were a robbery, they wouldn't have brought the case. I mean, there are cases that kind of stuff would kill. But that's the thing you have to measure when you're a prosecutor. If you truly believe someone is guilty and you think the evidence says they're guilty, but then you got a cop who's a complete enter the words you want to choose there, you're not going to just not do it because now it's hard. I mean, you're going to face it and you're going to move forward and you're going to try and prove whatever the sentiment is, the evidence proves something else.
This is what we mean. Like, you just have to play the card you're dealt, right? If anything, honestly, the fact that the prosecution is still bringing this case, despite having a massive black mark on their case, which is Proctor and everything he said, says something, because these are calculuses you made. There have been cases where maybe there is such a giglio issue with the cop who did the arresting or whatever that you decide, I don't know that we're going to be able to convince a jury. But despite knowing how bad these texts are and knowing how bad of a kind of sideshow this will become in the Karen Read trial, they still have a lot of other evidence. And the prosecution's job is going to be pointing to the actual evidence in the case and kind of not the sideshow.
Can you imagine prepping him
No,
for that
I'd
testimony?
be so angry. I'd have to really check my anger at the door before I prepped him.
Yeah. And you just got to be like, look, you're going to get drugged, man.
Well, that's the thing is, honestly, he probably knew, at least if I were prepping him, I'd be like, the first thing I'd say to him is I'd say, you're going to have to read all of this out loud in the court. Like, I would say that to him because it is so egregious and there's kind of, like, he wrote those words. Like, I would 100% prep him for it and be like, so be ready for that. Number one, don't get angry, don't get snippy, and don't be cute because you did it. You have to face the music,
Yeah, and you have to call him. I mean, some people thought they wouldn't call him. You can't hide from that. I mean, the defense will call him if you don't. And they'll just direct him on all that stuff. At least you get to take some of the sting out.
You can like front load it.
We're getting ahead of things because he's like 20 days from now, but he's a huge part of the case. It
says something when you make it into the opening because we do have a litany of witnesses, and he is taking center stage in the defense's opening statement.
So Proctor's going to continue to play a big role here. Remember, one of the issues for Read is there's a lot of evidence. Some of the evidence, for instance, are taillight pieces that were found at the scene, which would be consistent with her hitting John at the scene, shattering her taillight. Those pieces end up on the ground under the snow. And the defense will say it took a while to find these taillight pieces. Remember, there was a blizzard. The blizzard plays a huge role in this case. If Karen Read's guilty and she'd hit him in the summer, this would have been a completely different case. But because there was a blizzard, it took them a while to find this stuff. Or maybe it took them a while to find it because, in fact, they were planted at the scene by the police who only found the pieces later that day after Proctor had seized the car. Now, they also note that some of the taillight pieces were found much later by the police chief who just so happened to be friends with the Alberts. He was driving down the road and happened to look over, and what does he see in the grass? A piece of taillight. How convenient, according to the defense. And it also just points out how broad-based this conspiracy is. They then turn from sort of there's a conspiracy to do the opposite of what you saw the prosecution do. The prosecution wanted to humanize John. They wanted to make it all about John. Now the defense wants to humanize Karen. They talk about that day and how terrible it was for her, how it was one of the worst days of her life. She wakes up and John isn't there, and she's immediately terrified. This is not like him. He should be there. She gets up. She jumps in her car. She backs up and, she wasn't really paying attention. And wouldn't you know it, in a really unlucky coincidence, she strikes John's car, which the defense will say they can prove with video. When that happened, the taillight was broken in the driveway. And then, presumably, the police collected those broken pieces and sprinkled them over the next few hours and days on the side of John's body. Incredibly unfortunate for her and a great break for the police who were engaged in this conspiracy. And this is important because one of the reasons you have to have the conspiracy is because Karen Read's taillight's broken. Somebody broke it. And those taillight pieces were found there. They got there somehow. So it's hard to do a Karen Read is completely innocent defense and there not be a conspiracy. There has to be one. And they have to explain how that stuff got there and why and when her vehicle was damaged.
Yeah, that's a great point, because the undisputed evidence from both sides that they have to deal with is Karen Read's taillight's broken. Not only that, but pieces of it are at the site where John O'Keefe is found. So back away from that those two things are undisputed. What they are disputing is how those things happen to be there.
And look, we talked about this a little bit in part one. The defense is saying she's completely innocent. The prosecution is saying she's completely guilty. Despite that, it's possible the jury could say, I don't really buy either one of you. I think this whole conspiracy thing is bunk. I think this whole second-degree murder thing is bunk. I think probably what happened is she had too much to drink, she accidentally hit the guy, and it's a DUI homicide. The jury can absolutely do that, but that is not the argument the prosecution is making. They are making an argument that John was murdered by someone else, and the cover-up was the conspiracy. So that's where we're at. The defense will also claim that that search, which is critical for how long to die in the cold, occurred around 2:30. And that's when Jen McCabe, who was at the house that night, searched for that. And that's almost like, if that's true, right? In some ways, that is the most important fact. It is difficult. Coincidences happen in life. It is difficult to buy that Jen McCabe just so happened at 2:30 in the morning was like, oh, it's cold outside. I wonder how long it takes to die in the cold. And then someone just so happened to die in the cold. That didn't happen. So if the defense can nail that, that'll be a huge moment in the case. I would say definitive. Sometimes there's one piece of evidence that's really the thing. We talked about that some, going all the way back to the Adnan Syed case. And the reason people dispute those pings so much, the cell phone pings, is because if they're true, they're absolutely damning. And it's a similar thing here. It's like the fact that Scott Peterson just happened to be fishing in the bay where his wife's body turned up. I don't need more than that. That's enough for me. If that piece of evidence is true, he's guilty. If Jen McCabe searched for this at 2:27 a.m., I think Jen got a lot to answer for. So that's going to be a really important fact. And they also note that none of the people at the party saw John's body when they left, nor did the snowplow driver. Now, one thing that's interesting, and you're going to see this a lot, and this goes to sort of the inconsistency at times of the defense's argument. The defense is also going to say that everyone at that house is culpable in some way in this. They are all part of the cover-up because John arrived at that house, according to them, and went inside and was there for some time. Everybody there is going to say he never came in. So it's a little weird to then say those same people who you think are lying said they didn't see his body in the snow. Like, that's sort of a strange dichotomy. You would think that if they were in on it and lying about him never coming into the house, they also would say something like, well, now that you mention it, there was something weird over there, and I commented to my friend. I wonder what that is, but we didn't think to look at it, right? Now, there are some witnesses who say similar things to that, but nevertheless, you're going to see this a lot where people say things that are not helpful for the conspiracy who are supposedly involved in the conspiracy. The snowplow driver, talked about him a little bit yesterday. If he even exists, we'll have to see. Just don't have a lot of faith in snowplow drivers, having lived in Boston. Sorry if you're a Boston snowplow driver, but didn't find that as convincing from personal experience.
And he's also plowing at a very dark hour.
He's probably going fast, too.
He's probably going fast. And like, I mean, if you've lived in the Northeast and you've seen these snowplows, especially in a nor'easter, like snow is literally flying out the sides. So you're looking in front of you, but you can't see much on the sides. It's kind of like when you're driving through a rainstorm and you hit those puddles and like all the all the water is coming up on your side. So it mars your vision. That's kind of what a snowplows is like, just so you know, in case you don't live by snow, I say with authority.
Exactly. So the one thing you can absolutely say about this defense opening is it is compelling, it is riveting, it is incredibly interesting. Yannetti is a better orator than Lolly by a lot. Now, he does also go on too long. This was one of my criticisms. You know, I'm criticizing both these guys. Yannetti, he probably has like 20 times as much money as I do. He's an incredibly successful defense attorney. Everybody went on too long. And also, he is giving the defense a very heavy burden. He has to prove this conspiracy. And even if that's not technically true, and we talked about this a little bit in the first episode, it is still on the prosecution to prove the murder. And the defense, under our Constitution, they have no burden at all. But the reality is that when you start your opening by telling the jury your client was framed, and then spend the whole opening laying out how you're going to prove that, you're no longer in poking holes territory, which we talk about a lot. It's either she did it or there is a conspiracy. And you better prove the conspiracy, and they're going to put a lot of effort into that with basically every witness who testifies.
This episode of The Prosecutors is brought to you by Huggies Little Movers. Huggies knows that babies come in all shapes and sizes, and their tushies do too. Huggies Little Movers with its curved and stretchy fit. Moms know that there's nothing worse than an ill-fitting diaper, especially for your active babies. I love Huggies because I can rely on them to keep my baby covered while she moves around. You guys have heard about my sweet little baby. She just turned 1, deep into mobility. I am so excited about Huggies Little Movers because she can roll around, jump around, climb, which is everything she's doing. And I know that she is covered, and so am I in the cleanup.
And we all want the very best for our babies, and that's Huggies. Huggies Little Movers are curved, so babies feel comfy no matter how much they're moving around. And they're moving around a lot. They also offer up to 12-hour protection against leaks, which is a game changer. Get your baby's butt into Huggies Little Movers. We got you, baby.
And so begins all of the testimony. Just so you know, we spent a lot of time on the opening, and the openings were each just under an hour, I think. They both
pretty
went
short.
On.
I mean, they felt like they went on for a long time, but they weren't.
Was
like
it not an hour? It felt like an hour. Then I'm wrong. It felt like an hour each. But I will say, when you watch it, you'll see how there's no clapping, there's no fanfare after each of the opening statements, which are big theatrical things for the attorneys, right? When you do an opening, it is a big deal, but really all that happens is you sit down and then you call your first witness. So there isn't some big, like, everybody clap, everybody figure out what's going on, and then you just go straight into it. You literally sit down and the judge will say, all right, prosecution, call your first witness.
Which is really disconcerting, by the way, because it's such a big lead up. You're doing the opening's going to happen. You do the opening. It's like a big deal. Like, you're doing your opening. The other side's doing its opening. And then it's just like, okay, let's get started. And
I always find it kind of
feeling.
interesting because, like, with closing arguments, you obviously have the prosecution goes first and then the defense, and then you get a rebuttal, so you get to respond. Not in opening statements. There's no rebuttal to what the defense says. And so especially when you have Yannetti, who is a good orator, kind of tell this big story of, like, Karen Read has been framed. There's this conspiracy. Proctor is saying all these terrible things. Wah! Now let's set up the case with our first witness. I mean, it really honestly is, especially when you have an impassioned opening statement from the defense. There's no rebuttal. You truly go into the first witness. And remember, each witness is telling a tiny piece of the story, right? It's like an elephant. You're getting to see, like, you touch one piece of the elephant. And so your first witness typically is not able to, like, rebut everything the defense just said. And you see this here. There's a lot that the prosecution has to set up. So it's not like their first witness is someone who comes out and is like, nope, Karen Read wasn't framed. She was a malicious person who killed O'Keefe. That's not what happens. So just keep this in mind when you're watching any trial. And this trial, it really is kind of a roller coaster of emotions, but you have to keep it all inside because remember, there's no making faces, no commenting, no clapping in court. I always felt like it was such a letdown.
It is a letdown.
With like the first, like especially when you have an impassioned defense attorney who's like, and she was framed. Calling our first witness, we have Paul O'Keefe. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. You may have a seat. Can you please pull the microphone closer to your face? Yep, a little bit more. Yep. Okay. Now remember, we all have to hear you. Mm-hmm. Please don't talk over me. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, and the court reporter is going to be taking down everything you're saying, so please speak clearly. Does that make sense? Literally, that's what happens in a trial.
Now, in fairness, this one is I actually prefer the way this one goes because they did the openings and then took a break for the day.
They do.
Because they break
they're
for the
long.
day.
They were long openings.
Every 30 minutes in this trial. But nevertheless, so, that's how I remember it going at least. As they break.
No,
that's what
you're
you
right.
Like.
I'm being
but
a little dramatic.
when you have to roll right in, it's like, oh my goodness. Yeah.
I'm being a little dramatic. They really actually typically take like a pee break because opening statements are longer. But I'm not kidding where the first one, you don't get in. You have to take your oath. You have to go through all of especially with the first witness, what's going on. So the prosecution decides to kind of set the stage. Remember how they started the opening statement, talking about the kind of person John O'Keefe is, this loving father to the adopted niece and nephew that he took in, right? So there's testimony by Paul and Aaron O'Keefe, his brother and sister, talking about how John, even though he didn't have biological children of his own, when his sister and then his sister's husband passed away kind of unexpectedly very young and had these two young children, that John stepped up and became their father, took them in, took care of them, was their father. And they're really putting a name and a face and a man to the victim that we are talking about. This is very effective, and I think it's very important because we've all heard Karen Read's name a lot in the news, but obviously we're here because whether this was a conspiracy or a DUI or a malicious murder, this man, tragically, has been taken away much too quickly, who seemed to be well-liked, was a father to his niece and nephew when they were orphaned at such young ages. And so this is important to remember who the victim is here. And then, of course, we have testimony from them about this infamous Aruba trip that we did hear about in the opening statement, about how this was this big party. The whole family went, the niece and nephew, John, Karen, they were all there, and how they actually even got to stay an extra 3 days because Paul's daughter got COVID. And so they got to stay kind of an extra amount of time, setting up that this private relationship actually has a lot of eyes on it. That's the purpose of all of this, right? Because when you're on vacation, you're all living together, whereas we may not know what happens behind someone's closed doors, but when you're all together, you see a little bit more about someone's relationship, and it's a little bit harder to keep things all smiley on the outside. So Paul and his brother were supposed to get together on January 29th. Again, kind of showing at the prime of life, right? Like there's so much life that is yet to come for John. And Paul and Aaron, through their testimony, set the scene for the trial. They talk about John's death, the immediate aftermath, the devastation, the effect it had on them. Again, bringing it back to making the juror know and care about someone they can't meet, John, who is kind of at the center of the story, to focus on what happened there. Because if they care, then they're going to want to care about figuring out justice for John. And then there are also videos entered into evidence, and they're shown to the jury, demonstrating this incredible blizzard that was going on, this nor'easter that was going on the night that John died. Just
as an aside, this case really illustrates the very worst in true crime in so many ways. And there's this this is a sport cheering section. So there are certain people who are for Karen Read, and there are people who are against her. And some of the more prominent Karen Read people were making fun of this guy on Twitter as he's testifying about the death of his brother. And I just thought, wow, you're just awful people. I mean, what terrible people you are. I mean, whether you think Karen Read's guilty or not, this guy lost his brother. About his brother. Yeah. Like, not just his brother,
he already lost a sister too.
Yeah. Get your priorities in order. What's wrong with you? That's not what this is about. And just thought that was worth throwing out there. That is, as you often see in a trial, a lot of times the first few witnesses aren't really about the trial. They're more sort of setting up the people involved. And the prosecution, their opening statement, did that. And they followed that up with these witnesses. So it sort of follows along the opening statement. Then we have Officer Seraph, and this is when the story really starts. Now, he is the officer who responded to the call. And when he arrived at the scene, he found O'Keefe on the ground. There were 3 women, he said, waving him over. Karen was on top of John. She was giving him CPR, and she had blood on her face. He said this was on the property line, sort of the far left of the property, near a bush, a flagpole, and a fire hydrant. If you've been watching this trial, you've seen this picture 1,000 times. We've tried to describe this for you, and I got to tell you, we're going to do our best we can. This is when you almost have to watch, because so much of this trial is seeing stuff and listening to these witnesses and making determinations of credibility. So anyways, as we've said, imagine you're looking at the house. The far left property line is where John is found. And that's where he arrives. Now, we have his dash cam video. It is snowing hard, and you can tell that he says it was very cold. Very soon, other officers and the fire department arrive. The prosecution shows some photographs that demonstrate just how snowy it was that day. And they also point out that the driveway is a good distance from the location where John's body was found. So much of this prosecution, and you can argue about whether or not this is smart or not, is rebutting the defense case. So remember, what did the defense say? No one who was leaving the property saw John. Well, the prosecution wants to point out he was a long way from the driveway. He was a long way from the door. You wouldn't necessarily see that leaving in the middle of the night during a blizzard. So that's one of the things they're trying to point out. They also show the video from the police cruiser as the initial responders arrive, which just shows even more of this blizzard. And this initial part of this case is going to be a lot about just how chaotic the scene was because of the weather. The weather is a character in this case. On cross, and I thought this was interesting because Officer Seraph is like the least involved. I mean, he's the first guy there, but there's really not much indication that he is really connected to anybody. But the defense immediately has to start with him building this conspiracy theory. So they start off that there are discrepancies in the time officers arrived. And this was such a minor thing. It was almost like weird. Like it was literally like, this guy, didn't he really arrive 2 minutes before it says he arrived on the document? And you're kind of like, this seems strange, right? And I get it. I mean, part of it is just, how sloppy is this investigation that it says he arrived 2 minutes before he did? But they also suggest that there's like an effort to mask the address where the body was discovered because the dispatch log, which this officer has nothing to do with, and this drew a lot of objections, misstated the address by 1 number. And they actually ask him, was that done to protect the Alberts because they're police officers? And the guy's like, I have no idea, right? But it's like some of this is reaching, and you're going to see this. There are points where the defense is like scoring brilliant points. And then there are times where it's like you guys are throwing too much spaghetti at this wall. And this is kind of one of them where they're focusing on that. Much more important is trying to undermine what Officer Seraph says he heard. So during grand jury, he said that he heard Karen say repeatedly, "Is he dead?" Now, look, that is not that problematic. But what is problematic is her saying, "This is my fault." Seraph testifies that she said, "This is my fault," both in the grand jury and at trial. But where he did not put that is into his report. So, we have talked about this 1,000 times. If you're a police officer, we do trainings on this. If you're a police officer and you're writing a report, by God, you better put everything important in that report. Because if you don't, and 2 years later, you're testifying that the person who is accused of this said, "This is my fault," and you didn't put that in the report, you're going to be cross-examined on that. He says that was an oversight. I mean, like, not that believable, right? It feels like I would put that at the top of my report. Showed up to scene, man dead, woman said, "This is my fault." right? Like I might miss, is he dead in my report? But that I would include. So obviously this is a problem for him. Now at trial, Sarif is saying that Reed said, I did this. This is my fault. The prosecution is going to play the dash cam that Sarif has several times. It has sound. The sound is terrible. The defense says that Reed says, my boyfriend, I left him. He never came home. Now, ironically, when I was listening to this, I actually heard this is my fault. But as we've talked about before, that could very well be the power of suggestion because you can hear whatever you want to and stuff like this. So that was not that great. And they also make sort of the standard attack that you're going to see again and again, that the police did not really secure the scene or isolate potential witnesses quickly enough. The securing the scene was basically impossible because of the blizzard, but it is something that is in favor of the defense when they are attacking this case.
By the way, the testimony by Officer Sarif shows you very clearly why there are hearsay rules, right? Here we have Sarif saying one thing in his report, or not saying one thing in his report, but testifying to something else. And then, I mean, this is effective cross-examination, right? The defense did its job and compared what he said in grand jury to what he was saying in court to what he wrote in his report. This is what you're supposed to do when you prep to cross-examine someone, to look for inconsistencies, to slam them on. Now, are there innocuous reasons for that? Yes, this happens all the time. But it doesn't mean it's not good cross-examination. But you see how you can't do this cross-examination if Sarif doesn't take the stand, and instead you just have another police officer say, I thought he told me that Sarif told me he heard Karen Reed say, this is my fault. Well, did he really? Because he didn't write it in the report. Why didn't he write it in the report? I don't know. I'm just telling you what I heard. You see why hearsay is not as powerful of a witness and why it's important for Sarif to be there to be cross-examined, because now all of a sudden the jury's hearing kind of two sides of the story and credibility is at issue. And now other witnesses are going to come in and the jury is given two stories. One is that Karen Reed said, this is my fault. And the other story saying, no, it's being made up now. And over time, with all the other evidence and the credibility of other witnesses, the jury has to decide which story they believe.
And look, I mean, I'll be frank with you. If this were the only evidence against Karen Reed that this officer heard this, I wouldn't. Sorry. I've said this before. I'll say it 1,000 times. I know that officers forget to put things in their reports. I have read officers' reports that drove me crazy, but that is your job. I mean, I know everybody hates the paperwork. I know that. But you got to write it down. You got to put it in the report. And this is one of those things about this case. There's going to be a lot of criticism of the police and how they investigated this case, and that's fine. It's mostly justified. There's a lot of stuff that happened. These people are all human beings, and they made mistakes. This is a mistake. I think there is a difference between Officer Sarif is doing this intentionally because he has been made part of the conspiracy and whatever you think happened. I don't know if he heard that or not. And that's my problem with his testimony is because he didn't put it in his report. It's hard for me to credit what he's saying now. Memory is so fallible. We've talked about this so many times. And what's interesting, no one's going to quite say what Sarif says. And this is why we have trials, because we want to hear what all the witnesses say. And there's damning testimony from other witnesses for her, but not specifically this. And it makes me wonder if Sarif has conflated this in his mind.
Right. And remember, he's investigated. It might not even be intentional. It could be that as he is investigating this case, he becomes more and more sure that Karen Reed did do this. And this is why writing down things at the time that they happen is so important. And so Officer Stephen Mullaney takes the stand. He's a Camden patrolman, and he's the junior officer on scene. He arrived after Officer Sarif. And he'll testify that he heard Reed screaming, imagine this, what's written in the report, is he dead? And that's my boyfriend, many, many times. And he testifies that she was hysterical when she says this. Now, on cross-examination, again, I think this is very effective. He says that he did not hear Karen say that she hit John, and also did not hear her say that the accident was her fault. So this is what Brett was saying earlier. It's like no one quite has testified so far that they heard exactly what Sarif said. Now, Sarif was the first on scene, but now the jurors have heard another officer who was on scene who did hear the "is he dead? That's my boyfriend" hysterical. And then in his cross-examination, it's also drawn out that, remember, there are 3 women there, and they talk about Jennifer McCabe. We've already heard about Jennifer McCabe from the opening statement for the defense. This was the whole setting up, your bookshelf of evidence. Jennifer McCabe, they're alleging that she searched the 2:27 a.m. How long does it take for someone to die in the cold? And she's also there with Karen Read. And Officer Mullaney says that, no, she wasn't freaking out, and that there's nothing, it's contrasted with the way Karen Read is reacting, which is hysterical. And the defense is going to continue this Jennifer McCabe blame game. This is not the only witness it's going to continue with. But they continue with this one question being, did you ever see Jennifer McCabe bringing out blankets or anything that might comfort John O'Keefe? That's pretty bad, right? The whole point is she knows he's dead or couldn't care less that he's dead, right? But whereas Karen, the defense is trying to suggest here, is she's freaking out because this is brand new information to her. She cares about him. She would never do something like this. Now, the problem with the defense's approach here on Jennifer McCabe is that, remember, there were 3 women at the scene, and the other woman, other than Jennifer and Karen, is Carrie Roberts. So everything that the defense is suggesting about McCabe, how she doesn't care, this is not a surprise to her, can actually also be said about Roberts. So why McCabe, but not Roberts?
And Carrie Roberts is going to continue to be a problem for the defense. Now, one thing that I will ask, why did the prosecution call this guy? One issue I have with the prosecution in this case.
It undercuts their first officer.
Yeah,
I don't know. One after another, it sets up the perfect cross.
You don't have to call every single person who was at the scene. That's not a requirement. If the defense wants to call this dude later on, okay, fine. Let them call him, right? But why are you calling him? Just because he was there? I mean, he doesn't give you anything. And he allows, as Alice said, he sets up the perfect cross. So why are you calling him? Especially in a long trial like this, where you're going to have so many witnesses. This dude is utterly forgettable, other than he undermines what your first witness said. So
that's the weird thing, is he adds nothing, right? He's testifying. If anything, he takes away. But he's not the one who writes that report. He hears exactly what Seraph heard and then less. There's nothing that he adds. Literally nothing. He's the second on the scene. Maybe not even second on the scene. He's not the first on the scene. He's the junior guy taking direction from everybody else. We don't need him to know that there are 3 people there. We don't need him to know that Karen Read is hysterical. We have lots of other points of reference.
Everyone's going to say that.
Yeah, literally everyone's going to say that. And again, when you have junior officers, he's not great on the stand either. You don't feel for, the prosecution's story here. And this is an example of knowing how all your witnesses fit together. And it is truly an art form, right? As long as you're able to prove the elements, there's different ways of getting there. And so when you're drawing out your big map of trial and you have all your witnesses, and the order in which you call them is also an art form, right? If for some reason you had to call him, don't call him right after Seraph, because guess what they're going to slam Seraph on? The fact that the most damning piece of evidence he's going to say he heard from Karen Read is not in his report. You know that. It's in the report. You know this about him. So if you had to call Mullaney, don't put him right after Seraph.
You guys have all been cursed by watching Creighton Waters in the Murdaugh trial, because he was so good. And I guarantee you there were 100 witnesses they could have called in addition to who they called. And they didn't call him because that man knows how to build a case. And I'm not being critical here because, I guess I am, but I'm not really. Lawley, he's a great prosecutor, I'm sure, in his normal life. He's prosecuted probably 1,000 cases more than I have. But some of the decisions made are strange, and this is one of them.
Homes.com knows when it comes to home shopping, it's never just about the house or condo. It's about the home. And what makes a home is more than just the house or property. It's the location and neighborhood. If you have kids, it's also schools, nearby parks, and transportation options. That's why Homes.com goes above and beyond to bring home shoppers the in-depth information they need to find the right home.
And when I say in-depth, I'm talking deep. Each listing features comprehensive information about the neighborhood, complete with a video guide. They also have details about local schools with test scores, state rankings, and student-to-teacher ratio. They even have an agent directory with the sales history of each agent. So, when it comes to finding a home, not just a house, this is everything you need to know all in one place. Homes.com. We've done your homework. Okay, we're gonna do one more witness, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. Sorry, we talked too much.
Since we piled on Lolly for a second, I'll try to explain something for him. Trials, especially long ones with so many witnesses, literally you are sleep deprived and you move around witnesses late at night, day of, all these things, and you make mistakes. Right? Like he may have known here at some point that like these two back to back are terrible, but there are so many moving pieces to a trial. Truly, it is not just the witnesses on the stand. There are a million moving pieces. There are all these sidebars happening, which are usually legal, factual arguments that you're doing at all times. And I forget what my witnesses say all the time because before each witness, I refresh myself the night before about everything about their cases. This is why I draw up very detailed outlines for each of my witnesses because details get lost. But this is why you have second chairs and third chairs and fourth chairs who help you strategize and pull back and see these things. So it's very possible he knew this, but as people were being moved around on his trial list, he forgot, so that does happen. This is a very complex game you're playing.
And look, it's also possible that Patrolman Mullaney, when he was prepped, she said she hit him. And then he gets up on the stand and this happens. And I've told this story before, and Alice was present for this, where I had a witness who had just great damning testimony against the defendant. And literally like 3 days before he testified, we sat down with him and prepped him. And he told us this story. And we were like, really? That happened? He was like, yeah, that happened. And we were like, oh my goodness, well, we're absolutely going to ask you about that. Thank you so much for bringing that up. That's going to be very powerful testimony, et cetera, et cetera. He gets up on the stand, asks him the question. No, I don't remember that. And I'm like, and so then I'm kind of like subtly leading him to try and get the defense not to object. So I'm like,
it wasn't subtle. It was like real obvious.
Oh, other than saying like,
the defense counsel was laughing at this point. They're like, lead away. He's not going to give you anything.
Yeah. I asked this guy like 5 different ways this question, including basically saying, didn't this thing happen?
You literally said that.
No. And I'm like leaning over to the senior counsel on our case and be like, how else can I ask this? And he just never got there. And he was like, dude, did we talk to you? Did that happen? Is this like in a different world? I don't even know what's going on here. And so maybe something like that happened and he thought there would be something good there and it just wasn't. I don't know.
By the way, that witness was not lying. He got off the stand and we're like, dude, what happened? And he was like, oh, is that what you were asking me?
Oh, that happens so often. Oh, it just blows your mind.
Like they would, because remember, people are people, right? They get on the stand and they get nervous. They're under oath. They're sitting next to a judge in a robe and there's 12 to 16 people who are in the jury box looking at them and people in the gallery and people like literally have stage fright and blank out completely. Like that witness wasn't lying. The witness literally was like, oh, I completely forgot that. I didn't know that's what you were asking me.
And that's why I feel like lay people watch these trials and they just, in their mind, every witness is perfectly composed and everything they're saying is calculated. And I'm sitting here thinking, I wonder what happened behind the scenes on this guy, And so, I don't know, it's just a different perspective. And if you haven't been in it, you haven't been in it. And that's why we try to explain these things. So I don't know why they called this guy. It could have just been a complete mistake.
That's a great point.
Also
that
possible.
May have been. And you know what? Now you bring that up as a possibility, I do wonder if something like that happened because you can imagine this is why you also prep witnesses alone. He's a more junior guy. When you're all talking about things, think about you in a break room with a bunch of other people. You probably nod along and laugh along to stories that you have no idea what's going on with, right? Because we're all social creatures. We're like, and then someone will turn to you and be like, oh, did that happen to you? You're like, oh, no, I was just nodding because I like to be agreeable. So it's very possible that they were all talking about something and he even was like, oh, yeah, absolutely, that happened, you know? And then when he was under oath and he's under oath and he's like, well, did you hear it? Not did you hear Officer Seraph say it? Did you hear it? No, I didn't hear it. But I've heard Seraph say that, but I can't say that because that's hearsay. So now that we're grilling down and I'm under oath and I'm really having to be forced to answer the question, which is different than you telling a story. When you tell a story, I use hearsay all the time when I tell a story, right? Because you adopt things in your retelling as your own when you tell stories. That's not lying. It's just how we storytell, which is very different than answering questions under oath in court. So that may be what happened with him. He may have agreed that Seraph totally told him that before, but when asked directly, did you hear Karen Read say it's my fault? He had to think back and say, no, I did not hear it, but Seraph did. I trust him. If he said something, why wouldn't I believe it? But that's not the question. That's not the question he's being asked in court.
And I really want to get to Timothy Nettles' testimony, and I promise we will. But this is such an important point.
This is so important.
This is the problem that I have. I almost don't even want to do true crime anymore because I'm getting kind of sick of the way people act in this whole scene. So these are normal people, ordinary people, regular people getting up there. They're trying to do their best. Most of them are not malicious. Almost all of them are not malicious. They're trying to remember. Memory is terrible. And just imagine this case becomes famous. It's famous all over the country. Everybody's talking about it. And you're in the police department. Guess what you're doing? You're talking about this case. And the defense keeps bringing this up. Isn't it true that you talked about this in the firehouse? Isn't it true you talked about this in the police department? Yes. The answer is obviously yes. And that's a good thing that they asked that because the answer is absolutely yes. And trying to remember exactly what you heard that day versus what you remember hearing now is so hard, which is another reason, by the way, if you're a police officer out there listening, write detailed reports. Now, this guy, he's the minor guy. He is, once again, I don't know why the prosecution called him. Because he's the junior officer on the scene, guess what he's not doing? Writing reports. So we got this guy who's trying to remember exactly what he heard back then, and it's got to be really difficult. What did I hear versus what I've heard was said versus whatever. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult place to be in. It's why direct evidence is terrible. Circumstantial cases, way better than direct evidence cases.
And another thing, he's recalling something from 2.5 years ago. Remember how we've always said, if you're the defense, a mistrial is great for you because if the trial has to be done again, more time will pass. And what happens when time passes, our witnesses forget things. So we're already 2.5 years removed from John O'Keefe's death. And he's having to remember what he heard 2.5 years ago on the spot. And in those 2.5 years, they've talked a lot about this case. And a lot of that has become lore or maybe adopted into some of his own thinking of the case, which is different than how you tell a story out here in the firehouse or whatever versus on the stand. We see this all the time. Okay, next witness, and then we have to stop. This is going to take forever.
Alice is like, I want to go to bed. Okay.
No, I don't want to. No, I don't. I just, it's funny because we figure these things out as we talk, right? When we started, I was like, I don't know why they called him. And then as we're talking, I'm like, that's why they called him. He totally in prep said something else.
Which is very possible.
Yeah.
Okay. Timothy Nettle. And frankly, Timothy Nettle is probably the first person who actually matters in this case. He is a Canton firefighter. As far as I know, he has no connection to anybody, but when he gets there, he talks about how windy and snowy it was that morning. He talks about this is a blizzard, this is a nor'easter, this is just a terrible situation to try and respond to. He said it was hard to see even with lights. And if you've seen the video, it's dark outside. I mean, this is I lived in Boston. I love Boston, but oh my goodness, guys. Winter in Boston, it's like you're living in hell. I mean, it's always dark and it's always snowing which I love both those things. But nevertheless, for a lot of people, they don't like that. And so even at this point, you can't see anything. He can't see anything. So he gets there. It's still dark. It's still snowing. He says basically there was sort of a small pool of blood where John was laying. He says that John was wearing a heavy coat that had to be removed for treatment. Now look, we're not done with this trial. But it seems like he is the only person. This goes back to why eyewitness testimony is so flawed. He seems to be the only person who testifies that John was wearing a heavy coat. He is the only guy who says that John was dressed appropriately for the weather. Everybody else says he basically was wearing jeans, a shirt, and like maybe a light jacket or a light sweater or something, but he was not wearing a heavy coat. But this guy says, no, he was wearing a heavy coat. And just, as I said, eyewitness testimony, it's fascinating. And he even remembers his clothes being cut off, including this coat. He says that the injuries were generally to the right side of John's body, which is consistent with everything we've seen. He had scratches on the arm. He described them as furrows on cross, which Alan Jackson, who's a California lawyer, got a kick out of the fact he couldn't understand his accent. Alan Jackson hasn't won him a lot of fans in this case, but he's pretty effective on cross-examination. Anyways, he talks about how John had an injury to the right side of the front of his head. He had an egg-shaped hematoma, and his right eye was blackened, which the defense is going to say that's because he got beat up. Nettle says that when he arrived, and this is the key point, and this is going to be repeated again and again, and this, by the way, is one of those things. I don't know why people say this, but there is a story out there that the police sort of focused on Karen Read from the beginning without reason. But you're going to hear testimony similar to this from multiple people. He says that Karen said, I hit him. This was also consistent with what he testified to at grand jury. Nettle said that he heard Karen say, I hit him to another female, and the other female told her to be quiet. Now, the defense tried to say this was a change because he told the grand jury that he had asked Karen if she knew John. Nettle explained this was a typical question. The defense noted that he didn't tell doctors at the hospital that Karen Read said she hit him, nor did he reach out independently to the police to say that Karen Read hit him. Rather, he only told troopers when he was interviewed. This was pretty weak, I thought. They've had some powerful cross-examinations. This one was pretty weak. Like, the fact that he didn't tell a doctor that somebody else said she hit him doesn't
because
seem
it doesn't
that...
change treatment, right?
Right, exactly. And that he didn't, call up the troopers to say this. He only said it when he was approached. It's not very powerful. And you have a problem here that he doesn't seem like someone you would expect to be involved in this conspiracy. You've had people say things like, well, it's a conspiracy, sure, but it's only between all these people who know each other well. Well, most of them are that, but there are some outliers. He is an outlier. Why is it that he's saying this? Now, it could be that he's been influenced by discussions at the firehouse, as we just talked about. Could be that he's somehow been compromised by someone involved in the conspiracy. But nevertheless, whatever it is, you have to believe that this guy has been incorporated into this conspiracy either by accident or intentionally to say that Karen Read said, as soon as John was found, right after this happened, that she was the one who hit him. Now, I will say this. Even if she said that, it doesn't mean she actually hit him. She could just be hysterical. She could just be delusional. But that's a different thing than saying she didn't say it at all, which I think is the point the defense wants the jury to believe, that she never said that.
So the point about him not saying this until interviewed, where he didn't offer it, is precisely why we interview people, right? When we interview witnesses, we don't just sit down, open a notebook, and say, go. People can't remember things on the fly. Even if they saw something and heard something, like I hit him, right? You would think that's the first thing you would say in general. No, remember, there's so many things being taken in. There's the storm, there's the coat, there's the fact that someone's dead in front of you, that you're maybe trying to do life-saving measures, that there's lots of people around. right? He's a firefighter. He's not the first on the scene. There's police officers. There's blood on Karen's mouth, apparently, from CPR. There's a lot going on. And that's precisely why there are good interviewers and why you have like professional interviewers, because there are ways to draw out a witness's testimony. Things that after the fact, well, this was a really important fact. And we do this all the time in witness interviews. This is really important, sir. Why didn't you say that at the beginning? Escape? Like, I just didn't think of it. And this is why there's direct testimony and cross-examination. These questions elicit different ways of thinking that help trigger your memory. We have imperfect memories, right? Most of us do not have memories where we get to see the scene like a movie and we can describe every aspect of it. Even if you did, there are so many aspects of every scene that you're seeing. And some may jump out to your consciousness, some may not, depending on what's going on at the time. So the fact that he remembers this only, or he only says it when interviewed, is actually, like you said, I don't think that's very powerful.
Well, guys, we've gotten through 5 witnesses. There's only going to be like 200 in this case. So by 2029, we'll have finished the coverage of the Karen Read trial.
The trial may go till then, so,
The trial may go till then. But as we record this, the prosecution is still doing their thing, and we are going to continue to follow this case. We want to hear what you have to say, even though, frankly, this case has already driven me crazy. So I don't know that I want to hear what you've said. But if you want to let me know, shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for all your social media. Thank you to everyone who's joining us tonight on Patreon, our 100 best friends. You guys are awesome and so supportive, and we love it. I hate to hear that the Celtics are losing right now, but they do have a 2-0 advantage over the Mavericks, so we'll see what happens. Let us know what you think. Also, by the time we finish this, it's probably going to be October. So why don't you let us know what you want to hear in October so that you guys don't abandon us as you often do. I mean, recording this in June, but I'm just assuming this is going to go on forever. So I feel
like this is the new Murdoch.
It is. And I love doing this stuff. I mean, I hope you guys are enjoying this. I mean, the great thing about these long cases, I personally enjoy the tangents we go on. I don't know if anybody else does, but I enjoy them. I hope you guys enjoy them too. We try and tell you not just about this case.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's the thing. They're perfect case studies because we can tell you about hearsay all day long, but like your eyes can glaze over and it means nothing. But when you have like a perfect real life example and you're trying to show why certain rules exist and why things happen, it makes it come alive for me. It's like when the law is alive. It's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And man, you guys are fired up about this case. So we're fired up about it too. Next week, we're going to continue talking about more first responders, firefighters. And look, what's interesting about this and about these people, very soon, we're going to be talking about members of the extended Albert family, their friends, who they're married to, all these other people. But right now, we're talking about people who don't really have many connections to them. And some of their testimony is actually pretty bad for Karen Read. And if you think this is a conspiracy, you have to explain away this testimony. We started with this first firefighter. His testimony is going to be supported by a couple more people. Now, one of them, the defense is going to try and say has a connection to the Alberts, and maybe she does. But the problem is she's backed up by a couple other people. How do you explain that? And you have to explain it. And we're trying to reach truth here. I want all of us to be able to explain how we got there. Whether you think Karen Read's guilty or not, there are things you are going to have to grapple with as we continue with this coverage, and I want you to do it.
One of those things to keep in mind that's already come up, Carrie Roberts, a third person there, who is not Jennifer McCabe, not Karen Read. And there's some explaining to be done. And remember, there's based on the evidence, and then there's the actual evidence. Prosecution and defense can both be getting it wrong. But there are pieces of evidence here that's like undisputed, and you have to make sense of it. And that's what the jury has to do.
And the last thing I'll say on this, there has been so much written about this online by so many different people. We're having a trial, folks. And that is how we have decided as a society we're going to reach truth. Focus on the testimony and the evidence that comes in. Ignore the noise. It doesn't really matter what the blogger who hates Karen Read says or the blogger who loves Karen Read. That doesn't matter. The other thing, and this drives me crazy, not to rant, but I keep hearing people say things like, we haven't even heard from the medical examiner. We don't even know how he died. That guy's going to testify. Like, that's going to happen. We're in the middle of the trial, so maybe we should hold off on the criticism of what evidence we don't have until everybody testifies. At the end of this case, when the prosecution rests, if you think they haven't met all their elements, okay, let them have it. But I always find that weird. We haven't gotten to the thing that I think is really important, so I'm going to criticize the prosecution's case.
That's why
it's
you
a long
build
trial.
a case. It's like when you're building a house, you're like, I only see a foundation. There's not even a roof on it. It's like, we haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah, exactly. So patience. I know that's hard, but patience. All right. We'll be back next week. We're going to talk more about this case. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors.
I did buy a car, guys. Oh my god.
She did.
So, it was
Congratulations
so much
to Alice.
So much adulting. I'm so you know what's sad? The bruises from the car accident are still here. That's all. I just wanted to let you know that.
The bruises in her heart.
The bruises, no, physical bruises. Physical bruises. I'm so that's why honestly, okay, this is why I'm so tired. It's like I don't know how y'all's relationships work, like who let's just put it bluntly. I'm the mean one in the relationship. And so, like, even though I'm the exact person you take advantage of when you go to the, like, you would think, like, small little Asian lady who knows nothing about cars, I
bring
have
the
to
Adnan on people.
Yeah, I know, right? Well, I cannot send, and he'll hear this, and it's fine. I'm saying it to his face. You cannot send Mr. Alice to buy a car by himself because he would literally be the person who'd be like, I just went ahead and got 2 cars because they said it was buy 2 get 2 free. So like, I just bought them both. Like,
It's summertime, and with Pluto TV's Summer of Cinema, the streaming is easy. Stream hundreds of free movies on all your favorite devices all summer long. Chill out poolside with Mission Impossible and Transformers. Or stay cool inside watching Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, Titanic, or The Wolf of Wall Street. No matter your vibe, download the Pluto TV app to spend summer doing what you love. Watching endless movies. Tell me that's not the deal of the summer. Summer of Cinema on Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.